I want to really talk about some of the challenges that mangrove forests face if they are going to be a key contributor to climate change. And so it's not, we hear a lot about mangroves and blue carbon in particular, and how it is going to offset, all of the world's climate change emissions, and it is more difficult than that. But that does sound a bit negative. I will promise I will try and end on a positive note. Okay. So first of all, before I start anything, I just want to acknowledge everyone on this slide. What I'm going to present is largely their work, and I'm lucky enough to tag along onto some of it. So so I just want to acknowledge everyone whose work is going to appear over the next 30 minutes or so. Cool. So I'm going to discuss three things today. First of all, what is blue carbon, and particularly blue carbon in mangroves? It's a concept that quite a few people are starting to hear about, but there are a few misconceptions about it. So I'll just discuss what it is. I'll also then talk about some of the limitations of using blue carbon for conservation, but also for climate change mitigation. But I will try and end a bit positively and show examples and scenarios where mangrove blue carbon can make a good contribution. Okay, so just to put blue carbon in context, so carbon has got very colorful over the last decade or so. And we have some colors of carbon that are bad, and this is black carbon, brown carbon, and red carbon. But there's a whole suite of colors of this carbon rainbow which are positive types of carbon. And these are primarily types of carbon that are sequestering carbon from the atmosphere and storing it predominantly in biomass. And this is green carbon of forests, teal carbon of freshwater vegetated ecosystems, the newly established gold carbon of macroalgae and sargassum, and then blue carbon, which refers to vegetated coastal ecosystems, which have a high rate of carbon sequestration and capture. And so whether it's green carbon, blue carbon, or teal or gold, the idea is that we can use these natural carbon sinks to suck up our greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere, lock them away in these ecosystems as a way of offsetting our emissions and mitigating global climate change. And so that's the idea with all of these different colors of carbon. And so blue carbon in particular is coastal ecosystems, and this is mangroves, salt marshes, seagrasses, and most recently tidal freshwater forested wetlands. And a lot of other researchers are now interested to get their ecosystems into blue carbon, such as macroalgae and other coastal vegetation types. And the discussions of that are ongoing. If we can show that those other candidate ecosystems kind of pass the blue carbon test, and there's a couple of key criteria that they have to pass in order to be considered a blue carbon ecosystem. And the first criteria is that they must have a substantial scale of greenhouse gas removal, primarily through carbon sequestration. And so this graph is a systematic review of sequestration rates for a range of different ecosystems. And you can see here that blue carbon ecosystems, to the end of the graph, are able to sequester carbon in their biomass and soils at rates that generally exceed most other ecosystems, based on various fields measurements that are part of this compilation. So certainly mangroves, seagrasses, and salt marshes pass this key criteria that they are able, at least at the plot scale, so this is sequestration per square meter per year, on the plot scale, hectare for hectare, mangroves and other blue carbon habitats able to sequester really high rates of carbon. The next criteria is, it's no good just being able to take up all of that carbon if it gets released back into the atmosphere straight away. Obviously, if we want ecosystems to be a good mechanism of climate change mitigation, we need to be able to sequester that carbon, but then lock it up over timescales that make sense for climate change. And so we're looking at long-term storage of that sequestered carbon. And this is also something that blue carbon habitats do really well. And I've showed that in this graph here. So this is some field measurements we took in Czech Jawa on Pulau Ubin. So these are local data sets. And you can see that the mangrove in Czech Jawa is able to store about 500 tons of carbon per hectare. And seagrasses are about 150 and mudflats are similar. And I've also put another study by some NTU colleagues that did similar measurements of terrestrial forests in Bukit Nature Reserve. And you can see that the mangrove is storing almost twice as much carbon per hectare as, for example, a secondary forest in Singapore. And what's interesting about, what I think is interesting about this graph is where the carbon is stored. And this gets to the long-term storage part, because if you look at the white part of the graph of each bar, actually the amount of carbon stored in the above ground biomass is pretty similar between the secondary forest and the mangrove. The similar sized trees, similar density, etc. The difference is where the carbon is soiled in the dark gray parts of this graph. And this is the soil component. And this is where blue carbon habitats end up storing higher carbon stocks per hectare than other systems, is because they store it in their waterlogged soils. So when leaves and branches fall off of a tree in a rainforest and deposit onto the surface, some of it accumulates in the soil, but a lot of it is broken down by bacteria and fungi, and that carbon is released back into the atmosphere. And that process is a little bit different in blue carbon habitats because the soils are primarily waterlogged. So the microbial communities are different, and the breakdown of carbon isn't as great. So much like a peat swamp forest, a lot of that carbon gets locked up into the soil and doesn't get mobilized back into the atmosphere. So yeah, it's really the soil component, which is shown in this in the photo of the soil core here, which is really carbon rich and really makes it stand out from terrestrial ecosystems. But it's not just about knowing how much carbon is sequestered and how much is stored, because when we're trying to understand the true capacity of an ecosystem to be a carbon sink or source, it's just like a bank account. If you know how much money is coming in every month, but you don't keep track of how much you're spending, you have no idea actually how much your stock is. So just like a bank account, we need to calculate the carbon coming in from various sources, from the atmosphere, but also through sediments and dissolved carbon coming in on each tide, as well as the outgoing carbon, either through plant and microbial respiration, or through dissolved tidal exchange, or through groundwater exchange as well. So the idea is that we need to know all of these processes in order to understand if a blue carbon habitat is a true sink of carbon or not. And of course, this is a very simplified cartoon. This is what the blue carbon cycle in a mangrove looks like in reality. This was the PhD work of Clint Cameron, who in Sulawesi in Indonesia managed to calculate all of the different forms and fluxes of carbon within the mangrove ecosystem, including how it's connected to seagrass carbon as well. And so seagrasses would need another one of these diagrams and so on. And this is really all the major components from photosynthesis all the way down to kind of algal and biofilm respiration. And we need to get some numbers on as many of these little parts of the carbon cycle as possible in order to get that better understanding. So it's not as simple as just measuring sequestration and stocks. The third criteria to be a blue carbon habitat, and this is where the conservation focus comes in, is that it has to be a habitat that is under some kind of appreciable threat, either through natural threats or anthropogenic threats. And certainly mangroves and seagrasses in Southeast Asia really fit this criteria very well, because historically they have seen huge threats. So mangroves, we think in the late part of the 20th century, were being lost at about globally at 1 to 3% per year. which rivaled rates of loss in the Amazon and coral reefs, but didn't get the sort of attention that these more iconic ecosystems got. Now, the good news, at least for mangroves, is that there has been some kind of conservation success. And actually, even though we're still losing them, we're losing them at a rate which is an order of magnitude lower in the 21st century than it was in the latter part of the 20th century. So that's good news. But there is still a threat to mangroves. And Southeast Asia is the global hotspot for mangrove loss. It was historically, and it is still. And countries such as Myanmar is losing its mangroves at rates triple the global average. And that is continuing. So the work is not done, and mangroves still fit this criteria of having to be a habitat under threat. And this map here just shows for Southeast Asia what is causing those threats. On a global scale, about 60% of mangrove loss is anthropogenic, but almost all mangrove loss in Southeast Asia is caused by people, caused by land cover change for commodity production, particularly for aquaculture, but increasingly for rice and palm oil production. And that has implications for blue carbon. And so a number of studies now are starting to calculate the annual emissions caused by land cover and land use change in mangrove environments. And there's a spread of different ranges that I put on this slide from different studies. I think what's important to highlight is that in Southeast Asia, accounts for almost half of the emissions caused by land use and land cover change happening in mangrove forests. So again, we're the hotspot of deforestation, but also because we have the most carbon-rich mangroves globally, we are also experiencing the highest rates of emission from that loss. And so that loss and the conservation imperative to keep blue carbon in the ground and not emitting it into the atmosphere has created a huge interest in blue carbon as a conservation tool and as a climate mitigation tool. And that interest is even somewhere as small as Singapore, where there's a huge amount of discussion about how we can use blue carbon as part of our national carbon accounting. But globally and regionally, we see a lot of other countries putting a huge focus into blue carbon. And this really got kick-started after the Paris Agreement, and where blue carbon was starting to be talked about within those discussions. And now all countries that have blue carbon habitats are showing interest, not just for carbon, but also for the co-benefits that are protected if you protect under the umbrella of blue carbon. And so there's a couple of ways that we can use blue carbon for conservation to keep that carbon in the ground. The first is to use conservation projects that focus on avoided deforestation. So if somebody's about to cut down a mangrove forest, we pay them not to do that and to change their management action and to avoid that deforestation. And we can calculate the amount of carbon that was saved through that management intervention. Otherwise, we can restore mangrove forests and use carbon sequestration to, over time, increase the carbon stocks of restored mangroves. And we think we have about 800,000 hectares of suitable area that's biophysically suitable for mangrove restoration globally. So there's potential to do restoration on quite large scales. We can also use blue carbon as an incentive to change management practices. So if an abandoned shrimp pond is pumping out methane, if by putting mangroves onto that into that shrimp pond and it changes the amount of methane being produced by those ponds, that is a carbon saving that we can also calculate. So there's a couple of different ways we can use blue carbon, and people are starting to get much more innovative, including fisheries and how fisheries affects blue carbon. But these are the three main types. Whichever method we choose, we have to prove the additionality. So that either of those three options is increasing the amount of carbon beyond the baseline. So if that plot had been deforested But we are, by stopping that deforestation, we are creating additional carbon beyond the baseline, or creating additional carbon through restoration. So as long as we can prove this concept of additionality, which is really important in payments for ecosystem services projects such as carbon credits, then we can potentially pay people the value of that carbon that has been saved. So all sounds good so far, right? So why did I give you the spoiler alert at the beginning? Because what I've said so far is not as simple in practice, and when we try and implement it as a conservation project, as opposed to just a theoretical discussion of carbon. So there are three kind of limitations that I just want to introduce to you very briefly. And the first one is about scale. So I showed you this graph at the beginning, but I was a bit cheeky because I didn't show you the rest of the graph. I only showed you the top part. And this is really the issue of scale. That mangroves, as I showed you at the beginning, are great at the per hectare scale. So, you know, their rates of carbon sequestration per hectare are through the roof. Unfortunately, there aren't many hectares around the world of any blue carbon ecosystems. So compared to the surface area of terrestrial forests or tundra or grasslands and savannas, blue carbon ecosystems are very small. And that's, you know, not their fault. They're fringing ecosystems along the coast, right? And that's, you know, by necessity is quite a small area globally. So when you combine these two graphs to work out actually what the global carbon sequestration potential of blue carbon is, not the plot potential, then actually it becomes very low. You know, it's about 1% compared of all the other ecosystems. And so you can see that tropical forests, despite having lower local sequestration rates, because of their large areas, have a much higher global contribution to carbon sequestration. And so, you know, seagrasses, mangroves, and salt marshes are always going to suffer from their small extent. So, you know, on the global scale, are they going to be able to offset the world's emissions and keep us under 2 degrees? Probably not. The second constraint we're having is that, you know, if we have all of this potential to do conservation and restoration, but actually, you know, where can we do this in practice? So, you know, we calculated, you know, globally 800,000 hectares suitable for restoration biophysically, in terms of the right tidal range, the right sediment supply, and all the other conditions that mangroves need. But actually doing restoration on the ground is really difficult in mangroves, not because they're particularly, you know, we don't know how to grow them. I think we have a pretty good idea of the science, but it's a lot of social and economic factors that push restoration projects into areas that are not suitable. Because of land tenure issues in abandoned aquaculture ponds, for example, it's much easier to plant mangroves on mudflats, which have no ownership or contested ownership, but they're mudflats for a reason. They can't support mangrove plants because the physical conditions are not suitable for mangroves to grow there, or else they would already be growing there in the first place. So, yeah, we don't have a great track record of doing successful mangrove restoration at scale, despite the hundreds of millions of dollars that have gone into mangrove restoration, even in Southeast Asia, particularly after the Indian Ocean tsunami, where, you know, mangroves really became in the spotlight as a potential nature-based solution to coastal adaptation. So despite the effort, despite the knowledge, despite the money, we're seeing a lot of constraints to doing restoration at the sort of scale that we need to if we're actually going to make a dent in global climate change emissions. And so I give you just one example here of where we try to calculate, you know, actually where could restoration happen. And this was a study that involved some NTU colleagues, and it wasn't just mangroves, it was also peat swamps and degraded tropical forests. But for the mangroves were part of this, and it showed that once you know, it doesn't matter really kind of how much land is biophysically suitable, because once you start adding in a number of socioeconomic and governance constraints, for mangroves in Southeast Asia, only 5 to 35% of the biophysically suitable area is actually socioeconomically suitable to also do restoration. So we can come up with these big numbers, but actually planting them on the ground requires us to also understand opportunity costs, land use constraints around people who may already be using those spaces and may not want to easily give them up, as well as operational constraints on the cost of restoration, on the manpower requirements, etc. So it's not as easy as just finding a huge amount of area and then planting them up to save or sequester carbon. So, there are a lot of restrictions and constraints to doing it blue carbon conservation at scale. And then the third constraint that we're facing is that we want to use mangroves to help mitigate climate change, but they themselves are vulnerable to it. So there's a common kind of misconception that mangroves love being by the sea, and they love seawater, and that's the ideal environment for them. They can tolerate seawater, but they don't like it. You can grow them in fresh water as well. It's just the difference is mangroves have evolved over the last 80 million years or so to be able to tolerate tidal flooding and other physical variables that we find along the coast. It doesn't mean they like it. And of course, with climate change and accelerated sea level rise, what we're worried about is that the frequency of tidal inundation will increase beyond the tolerance that mangroves naturally have to tidal flooding. And there's been a few studies that have shown this really well. And I highlight this because a number of NTU colleagues were involved in it. And it, using the geological record to look at where and how mangroves have been able to keep pace with sea level rise by, in this case, accreting sediments and other organic matter sources to try and keep pace with sea levels. So as sea levels rise, if the mangrove can accrete enough soil and to increase its elevation, then it can potentially keep pace. And this study that came out late last year showed that mangroves are pretty good at keeping up with sea level until you hit an upper threshold of about 7 millimeters a year, where they're not able to accrete sediments at faster rates to be able to keep pace. And we've taken a similar view, looking at kind of accretion rates and surface elevation change rates and comparing them to in this case, projections of sea level rise using field measurements over the last 20 years or so of surface elevation change in mangroves, as well as suspended sediment and other data sets to look at which mangroves may be vulnerable to climate change by the end of this century. And in this map, based on the RCP 8.5, we can see that there are a number of mangroves around the Indo-Pacific that we expect to be vulnerable to climate change, in the next couple of decades. And this is basically locations where sea level rise is going to be greater than surface elevation change of the mangroves, and that they will start to be in this accretionary deficit, and they will start to be at mean sea level or lower. And if we zoom in to some of this map, there are some things that all of these sites have in common. And it's generally places with low tidal ranges, which makes the relative change of sea level rise greater and hence makes them more vulnerable, or areas of low or reduced suspended sediment concentration. And really, suspended sediment is one of the key mechanisms by which mangroves can accrete soil and potentially keep pace with sea level rise. So this is certainly something that we should be thinking about when we're planning blue carbon projects, because this is not 200 years away. These are in the next couple of decades, mangroves will start to become vulnerable. And so we can use maps like this to maybe highlight areas where blue carbon projects may be more sustainable over the long term. And long-term is key because that is one of the key criteria of blue carbon, that we need to be locking it up over long time periods that actually make sense for climate change. So there are three big constraints there, and there are obviously many more, and these are just three to think about, and three that are really kind of large scale, but there are a number of very kind of site scale constraints we need to consider as well. But despite that, I want to give you a bit of optimism and a bit of hope, and show you places where actually there are situations where blue carbon might be able to make a contribution to carbon sequestration, and also then to broader conservation and the conservation of other co-benefits, including biodiversity. And so there are some national scales where blue carbon does make sense for some countries. And so particularly countries with relatively low emissions, but large coastlines and large areas of mangroves. In those cases, mangroves are able to offset, a few percent of their greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's, the countries such as Nigeria and Cuba fall into that category. So for some countries, the nationally determined contributions of the Paris Agreement, which are national scale, mangroves can actually make a contribution to that. But for me, I think where the real benefit lies is at the local scale. And it comes back to that point about the very high rates of local carbon sequestration that mangroves are able to provide. So that means we can actually create potentially more carbon credits for one small carbon site for mangroves compared to other ecosystems. And we've done some of these calculations, again, for a restoration site in Sulawesi, where the mangroves were measured to be sequestering almost 30 tons of carbon per hectare per year. We could actually increase that even more if we include sequestration by other components of the mangrove ecosystem, such as algae, etc. So we may almost be able to generate a net 70 tons of carbon per hectare per year, which is a lot compared to other potential carbon credit projects. And we listed some here on this graph. These are predominantly terrestrial projects, and the average tropical rainforest project is generating about 11 tons of carbon per hectare per year. And so, we can get, 3 to 7 times as much carbon per hectare out of a blue carbon project compared to some of these other projects. So where space is at a premium, or at the site scale where you are using this as a livelihoods project and you are selling these carbon credits to benefit local communities, then we can generate more credits for the same sized project in mangroves. So I think that is really important to consider, that even though on the global climate scale, one mangrove carbon credit project is not going to make much of a dent, it will make a huge difference for communities who are relying on those carbon credits as a source of livelihoods. And then even at broader scales, there are situations where the finances work out. So this is a study that's just been accepted and will be out in a few weeks, where we looked at the threat caused by land cover change to mangroves. And these are what we call investable mangroves, because again, you have to show additionality, right? You have to show that you'd be saving carbon. So we could able to map mangroves that are investable or under threat and hence are suitable for carbon credits, as well as the mangroves that would be profitable. If you take into account the opportunity costs and the costs of management and restoration and all these other things, and based on current carbon credit prices, we can also count the mangroves that would be profitable under these kind of scenarios. And it turns out that about 20% of the world's mangroves are investable. They are under potential threat, and would be suitable for carbon conservation. And actually 10% of the world's mangroves may even be profitable. because in those countries, the costs of conservation are lower compared to the amount of carbon that is stored. So, if you could tell somebody that you could protect 20% of the world of an ecosystem on the planet, I think that's, a lot of people would be impressed by that. These are very coarse global estimates, of course, but it goes to show kind of at least the distribution or where we should be prioritizing carbon conservation, and the fact that there are a number of mangroves around the world that are suitable to be considered for blue carbon projects. Now, of course, I have to bring back climate change into this, that this map doesn't take into account some of those climate change maps I showed you earlier. So again, where should we prioritize, and which of these areas are suitable under projected climate change, including how climate change can also help ecosystems sequester more carbon. By forcing ecosystems to accrete more, they increase what's called their accommodation space, and that actually gives them more potential to sequester carbon. So actually some rates of sea level rise may be suitable to do carbon projects in as well, because it will encourage more carbon. So it's not just as complex, as straightforward as climate change is bad for mangroves. It all depends on the rates and the individual geomorphic settings of each site. So to summarize all of that, I hope I've convinced you now that mangroves are a really key part of the coastal carbon cycle, and that cycle is really complicated, but we are able to measure many components of it now. It's good that we can measure it so that we can start to get the evidence for mangrove blue carbon, but I think we have to be aware that there are several limitations, and it's not going to be an easy job to mitigate the world's climate change through mangroves alone. And even if we want to do mangroves conservation for things beyond blue carbon, we face a number of constraints to doing it. And one of those constraints is definitely climate change. But despite all of those constraints and limitations, I really do see some really unique opportunities in the future. And I think really the local scale conservation aspect for me is where we really should be investing a lot of time, because as that's really going to be helping coastal communities that are relying on mangrove forests. So with that, thank you very much.